All right, in this video, we're going to go over the physiology of the pituitary gland, which is probably the most important organ in the entire endocrine system. It's basically the link between the brain and the rest of the body as far as endocrine hormones go. So there are a lot of different hormones. We're not going to get into the fine details of all of them, but this is going to be an introduction into how the system works. And a lot of these hormones are going to show up in other systems, especially when you get to kidneys and reproductive physiology later on in the class. This is going to be critical. So to start off with, the basic setup of this anatomy, if we zoom in here, is we're looking at structures that are at the base of the brain. What they have highlighted here is the hypothalamus, and then these structures down here are the anterior and posterior pituitary. Just remember, the hypothalamus is actual brain tissue, so that's nervous system. The pituitary, both anterior and posterior, are endocrine system. And so that's why we say that this is the neuroendocrine link, right? This is where your brain gets to control which hormones get released. And in many cases, the hormones coming out of the pituitary are going to circulate through the body and either stimulate or inhibit other endocrine organs like the thyroid or the adrenal gland. And so this really is sort of the master regulator of the endocrine system, right? So in this picture, we've got these neurosecretory cells, which really just means that they are neurons, right? They're part of the brain because we're in the hypothalamus up here. And those neurons connect to the pituitary, right? So in this picture, we're looking specifically at the posterior pituitary on the right side of this picture. And the posterior is actually the simpler system in this setup. These neurons, these neurosecretory cells, live in the hypothalamus, and they specialize in one of two hormones. They either make ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone. Some textbooks will call it vasopressin. It's the same thing. Others make a hormone called oxytocin, which mostly has its role in the reproductive system. And so we're not going to get into the details of that one now. But the idea is the cell bodies of these neurons live up here in the hypothalamus. And these yellow lines with the arrows are showing you that the axons of those neurons travel out of the hypothalamus, right, through this little connector, this little stalk of tissue called the infundibulum, and down into the posterior pituitary. Right? Once you're in the posterior pituitary, you've got a capillary bed with some blood vessels, right? So this capillary plexus, that's what we're really after. Remember, the brain has limitations because of the blood-brain barrier as far as which molecules can and can't cross that barrier. And we need to get the hormone out of the brain so that it can be released directly into the blood. So it's pretty simple. If your hypothalamus decides that you need either ADH or oxytocin, it will send electrical signals, right, action potentials down this axon that trigger the release of the hormone into this capillary bed, right? Then hormone can exit out of the blood vessel, enter circulation, bind to receptors on really any cell type throughout the body that it is a target cell for. And so this part's pretty straightforward. Your hypothalamus just decides when and how much hormone is being released. The posterior pituitary is just the site of release because that's where we have access to blood vessels. Right. The anterior pituitary is a slightly more complicated setup. The beginning is the same in that we still have neurosecretory cells, which are neurons up in the hypothalamus. They have axons that are projecting down this way. The difference is they release their hormones into the blood right here at the infundibulum just before you enter the anterior pituitary. And the difference is we now have two sets of hormones. So these neurosecretory cells release what most people just call releasing hormones, which I've got a list of these in a minute that we'll see. Those releasing hormones enter the anterior pituitary and trigger the release of another set of hormones, right? Whatever the final hormone product is. So as an example, the neurosecretory cells up here produce a hormone that is very aptly named growth hormone releasing hormone. And all it does is tell cells in the anterior pituitary to release actual growth hormone, right? So it seems like an unnecessary extra step, and to be honest, it kind of is, but this is just the way the system is set up. So I call it's like a game of molecular telephone. Hypothalamus releases a releasing hormone, tells the anterior pituitary to release the final product, the hormone that we're really after. That hormone goes out into general circulation and has its effect throughout the body. Right? So you can see this under histology. This is a picture from a microscope. Notice the obvious difference. The posterior pituitary, the tissue looks very light and stringy. You can see what look like almost these thread-like structures coming down into the posterior pituitary. Those are the axons of those neurosecretory cells, those neurons from the hypothalamus, right, that are traveling down the infundibulum into the posterior pituitary. You can't really see the capillaries very clearly here because we're not zoomed in far enough and they're just too small. But you can recognize that posterior pituitary tissue because it looks very light and stringy. Those are just axons. The anterior pituitary, you can see, looks very dense. Remember, when you look at histology slides like this, the dark purple color is a DNA stain for nuclei of cells. The anterior pituitary is much more densely packed in endocrine cells because they have to actually produce their own hormones, right? That's why we see the much darker, denser staining on the anterior side. Okay, so either way, the pituitary is where the hormone gets released into the blood. It's just a matter of exactly how that happens on the posterior versus anterior side. And in the end, the hypothalamus is always the organ that's really in control. The pituitary is just sort of doing its bidding. All right, so here's our list of hormones. The posterior pituitary, you only have two options, right? ADH or oxytocin. Very straightforward, very direct. I'm going to get into some detail on ADH in a minute. Oxytocin, we'll save for when we get to the reproductive section because that's where oxytocin has its effects. All right, on the anterior side, the way this is set up is this column is showing your releasing hormones. Right? This column is showing you the actual hormone that's leaving the pituitary and having its effect throughout the body. This column is showing you the target organ or cells that are responding to the pituitary hormone. And then here we're getting the effects. Okay? And so a lot of these, LH, FSH, and prolactin especially, have their effect on the reproductive system. We're not really going to deal with those right now because we'll have an entire section on reproduction later. And so for now, I'd like to cover a couple other ones. TRH and TSH. TSH is what you would call a tropic hormone. It only has the job of telling the thyroid gland what to do. And so the chain of events is the hypothalamus releases TRH, which tells the anterior pituitary to release TSH, which tells the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones, which we'll see in a later section. Thyroid hormones are T3 and T4. So your hypothalamus is effectively in control of the thyroid gland. It's just using TRH and TSH as messengers to tell the thyroid when it needs to turn on, make T3 and T4. Right? Couple other examples. GHRH I already mentioned. That's growth hormone releasing hormone, which triggers the anterior pituitary to release actual growth hormone, which goes into the body and has a handful of effects on tissue growth and repair. I've got a slide on that coming up in a minute, so we don't need details. But again, hypothalamus is in control. Pituitary just follows instructions. Growth hormone leaves, enters circulation, gets the job done. Okay. Last one, CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, tells the anterior pituitary to release ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone. And it has the effect of stimulating the adrenal glands to release a group of hormones called glucocorticoids. The only glucocorticoid that you're likely to hear anything about is cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone that impacts glucose metabolism and immune function and a lot of different things. We'll see cortisol eventually when we get to the adrenal glands. But what I hope you can see in all of this is the series of communications. Hypothalamus makes the decision, uses the releasing hormone to tell the pituitary which hormone it should release, and then that hormone either goes out and has an effect directly, like with growth hormone, or an indirect effect by telling another endocrine gland to do its thing, like the thyroid or the adrenal. Okay, so like I said, a lot of those hormones are going to come up in later videos or even in later systems. So the couple that I want to add a little bit of information onto right now, antidiuretic hormone, remember, is one of the hormones released by the posterior pituitary. Its effect is to control the concentration of urine formation, which impacts the concentration of solutes in the blood, right? And so this is a water balance thing. And the organ control that controls water balance is obviously the kidney. And so the effect of ADH is to stimulate the movement of a set of channels called aquaporins into the collecting duct of the kidney, right? So I want to use this as an example of the kinds of effects that hormones stimulate. And aquaporins are water channels. So if you add more of those water channels to this structure called the collecting duct in the kidney, right? If fluid leaves the bottom of the collecting duct, it's off to the bladder as urine formation at that point. And since ADH is anti-diuretic hormone, or a diuretic is something that makes a person lose water, it would make them increase their urine output. An anti-diuretic makes a person retain water. So if you're dehydrated, your hypothalamus can sense that, trigger the release of ADH. ADH tells these collecting duct cells in the kidney to add more aquaporins. Aquaporins allow water to flow out of the collecting duct and back into the blood, decreasing the amount of water that's lost as urine. So it's effectively a signal to tell the kidney, hey, we're dehydrated. You need to save as much water as you possibly can so that we don't lose any more to urine than we absolutely have to. All right. All these other hormones like angiotensin and aldosterone, we'll deal with those when we get to the kidney section. All right. And the other example, the example from the anterior pituitary that I'm going to use is growth hormone. So remember, hypothalamus makes GHRH, tells the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone out into circulation. And growth hormone is an interesting example where you get a lot of different responses, right? You can increase nutrient levels in the blood, right? Lipids and glucose. You can stimulate growth of tissues that are able to divide and repair themselves, like muscle and bone and connective tissue. In cells that are already dividing, growth hormone can act as a mitogen, signal that increases mitosis or cell division. For the most part, this only happens in children, right? Because children are the only ones that are still growing. So if you give growth hormone to a child, you will make that child taller than they would have been in the long run because they have dividing cells in their bones that are going to now divide even faster. In an adult, that wouldn't happen because an adult's bones aren't dividing. And so you can speed up division that's already happening, but growth hormone can't make cells start dividing that otherwise weren't, which is why you can inject an adult with growth hormone all you want. You're not going to make them get any taller than they already are. Okay, so those are direct responses on tissues. Interestingly, growth hormone levels go up during a handful of activities. Strenuous exercise makes sense because it causes tissue damage on muscles and tendons and bones that needs to be repaired. It makes sense that growth hormone levels go up at night when a person is sleeping because during sleep is when a lot of tissue repair happens. Fasting is an interesting one. If a person doesn't eat for an extended period of time, growth hormone levels can also go up, which appears to be a way to prevent muscle wasting. Right? It's also a way to release those nutrients like glucose and fats and even proteins from tissues, right? Because you have to be living off of your stored energy at that point. Okay, hope this was helpful. Again, make sure you keep track in the playlist. The videos go in order in a way that I think makes sense, and you can subscribe to the channel to make sure that you see anything new that comes up. And our next video, we'll start going into the thyroid gland and then move on to other endocrine organs from there.